Welcome to Practical Tactical. Today what I'd like to talk about is the ballistic coefficient of different projectiles. I have a couple of boxes here just for illustration purposes. These are 150 grain flat base 30 cal with a G1 BC of 0.398, and over here I have some 185 grain Burger Juggernauts with a G1 BC at 0.560. So you might be curious, what is the difference if you don't understand BC? You might be curious, what's the performance difference of these different projectiles downrange? So this is what I'm going to explain to you, exactly what's the payoff when you switch different projectiles with different BCs in your rifle. I have some other examples here where here's one from, it's the Hornady A-tip. This is a 22 caliber 90 grain Hornady A-tip with a G1 BC on the box of 0.585. That's extremely high for a 22 cal round. And then there's others. I have 88 grain Hornady ELD match. This is one of my favorites. And the G1 BC on these is 0.545. So for a 22 cal round, that's a pretty high BC, and the price isn't too bad for less than $40 a box here in Canada. So what I want to do is explain what exactly is the payoff when you're using these different rounds, and and how it performs downrange. What is the difference that you can expect when you're actually using such a thing? If you don't understand what ballistic coefficient is, it's basically a numerical representation of the aerodynamic efficiency of the projectile, and but what does that value really mean? So when you see the number, this one's a 0.4, this one's a 0.5, this one's a 0.6 something, what exactly does that mean downrange? So that's what we're going to get into today, and I want to thank you again for tuning in, and we'll get right into it. One of the things you gotta be a little bit careful about when it comes to BC is that the numbers are put on these boxes by marketing people. So sometimes when a particular box has a certain number on there, and I'm not making any I'm not trying to say that Burger is not honest with their numbers, but some companies are not. So I want you to be aware that when you're looking around at these numbers on the internet or on the box, don't always trust them until you verify them. And there's a young guy by the name of Brian Litz who's been making a bit of a name for himself in the shooting community, where he does a ballistic analysis of the performance downrange of these different projectiles, and he has his own profiles that he develops based on what I understand to be Doppler radar performance of these particular rounds being fired over a distance. So he has a scientific profile that has been developed specifically to each of these rounds, regardless of what the manufacturer number might be. So if you're using applied ballistics, you're probably familiar with it, that he has his own library, and these are custom ballistic curves that describe the flight characteristics of a particular projectile based on his own testing. So he's kind of like a third-party Consumer Reports kind of guy who regardless of what number is on the box, he verifies it factually. But so in terms of using a applied ballistics program or one of the ballistics calculators that he supports, you can download his profiles and use them. But if you don't have any of that and you still just want to go, well, exactly how do these different rounds perform? Higher is better, but are you really going to get everything that you've signed up for when you buy it on the box based on a certain number? You see a number on the box and you want to build a rifle around a particular cartridge or a particular projectile. So you're trying to determine what should you use, and then you go off and you think you're going to be competitive because you're using a certain thing, and it doesn't always pay off, and it's because of the fluff in the numbers in some cases. I remember some years ago I developed a rifle where it claimed a 585 BC, but it turned out to be 535 BC. And when you're trying to be competitive in F-class, that kind of takes the wind out of your sails very quickly when you come to that realization that you've been sold something that's been inflated. And that's happened to me. It's probably happened to a lot of you guys, but the number on the box is the best number you have for evaluation purposes, and regardless of whether there's fluff in the numbers, what I'm about to explain is assuming those numbers are correct. So we'll dispense with that spread between what I actually see on the box and what I'm actually getting when I'm out in the field. We'll leave that off the table for now. We'll just compare the numbers the way they crunch. So let's take a look at some ballistics programs, and we'll go into some analysis. I'll use what's commonly available, JB Ballistics or something. So we'll go on their website, and we'll take a look at what they calculate to be the flight characteristics of specific projectiles with specific numbers, and I'll show you where you can see there's a linear relationship between the ballistic coefficient that's used and the downrange performance. So it's a very tightly correlated performance difference. So if you've got a 0.2 BC round versus a 0.4 BC round, what exactly does that mean? So we're going to get into that, and we'll explain exactly what I mean by that. How the rounds retain velocity downrange, and what that affects their angular wind deflection at distance. So there's again a very direct correlation between these numerical ballistic coefficient values and where that wind deflection is going to be and the velocity retention. So now, before we get into even that, I want to explain one more thing, is the difference about bullet weight. So if you're comparing a smaller caliber like this, a 22 cal round, okay, to a 30 cal round, you think, well, the 30 cal round is bigger and heavier, so it's going to have better ballistics. That's not really true. The ballistic coefficient, it doesn't matter how heavy the round is, the bullet's flight characteristics are going to be identical. There is, however, a difference in what's called gyroscopic stability. So a larger 30 cal round, because it's larger, think of it as like a gyro, or like a flywheel or something like that. It's a bigger flywheel, so it's easier to obtain gyroscopic stability with a 30 cal round by virtue of its diameter than you will get with a 22 cal round. And that makes the 30 cal rounds a little bit more stable once they're going through different weather conditions, flying down range, and also when they're entering into the transonic range. So the larger rounds tend to have a little bit better stability, and by virtue of that fact, they tend to be more consistent at longer ranges. So we'll leave that off the table again for the purpose of this discussion, but we will just explain what these ballistic coefficient values mean downrange. And there's also, I guess, one more thing, is that on this box it says at the top G7 BC, and down at the bottom it says G1 BC. So again, we're going to leave that alone. What those numbers are, G1 and G7, are basically the velocity degradation and wind drift characteristics of these rounds. They're different formulas to use for different bullet types. So in this case, these are flat base bullets. So this one would be, it's only got G1 BC on the box because it's a flat base bullet. This one, they put both the G7 and the G1 because it's a boat tail. So the boat tail rounds are more close and more accurate to the flight characteristics using G7 than the G1. So again, we'll leave that alone for now. We'll focus on the G1 BC, and we'll ignore that other thing because it's really kind of irrelevant to the point that I want to make about the quantifiable difference in downrange velocity and downrange wind deflection. So we'll get into that. I guess while we're on the topic of a ballistic coefficient, one thing that you want to pay attention to is the spin rate on the box. So it'll say for 1 in 12. So this one here is the Burger Juggernauts. It says for 1 in 12 twist barrels. This one here says the 90 grain A-tip says it's for 1 in 7 twist barrels. So you want to make sure, you can't just look at the ammunition and go, well, I just want to use that particular round. It doesn't mean it's necessarily going to fly straight in your particular rifle. As a matter of fact, it might happen to fly a whole lot worse just because you don't have the appropriate twist rate. One point on twist rate is that when they put that on the box, it's kind of making certain assumptions about the muzzle velocity that you're going to achieve. And so if you can't get to the muzzle velocity that is within the range of what they intended when they put that on the box, you might have some complications. So if you're going a little bit faster, you can actually slow down the spin rate. If you're going a little bit slower, you're going to need to have a faster spin rate. So of course that affects the barrel selection. Another thing that you have to pay attention to, especially with these, what I'm really talking about here mostly is high efficiency bullets, or very low drag, VLDs they might call them. So these are bullets that are known to have a very high BC, and to have a high BC within that specific caliber, it needs to be longer. So because it's longer, you need two things. The length of the projectile is part of the reason why we need the faster spin rate, but also to maximize the velocity out of your particular rifle, you need to have a throat that's long enough to utilize that round. Now, when you're setting up a rifle, you want to make sure that the base of the bearing surface on the bullet is ahead of the donut. So on the case, you've got the neck and then the shoulder, and right in that corner is where we call the donut. And you want to make sure that the base of that parallel portion of the projectile is seated ahead of that. Now, in order to do that, we will typically seat around like that, send it to our reamer manufacturer, a chambering reamer manufacturer, and have him make a reamer that is designed for that particular seating depth with that particular projectile. So if you're not somebody who's thinking about that kind of thing, you've got to factor that in when you're evaluating the kind of performance that long-range shooters get with a particular cartridge. And you don't want to try to use or try to chase the same velocities that somebody with a long-throated rifle can achieve with a high BC bullet, which is probably a heavy bullet for that caliber. Like this is a 90 grain bullet for a 223, well, 22 cal. So this is a long bullet to seat in a 223, and if you're running an AR-15, for example, you got maybe a maximum 2.3 inch overall length on a cartridge. But when I seat these, I'm seating them more like 2.650 or so. So they're way longer than what an AR-15 magazine would be able to shoot, and of course my velocities are much higher. Part of that also helps. That long-throated rifle also helps to align the projectile into the rifling. So when you have a short chamber like you typically have in an AR-15, for example, it's going to be too short to get any kind of performance out of something like this. And while we're on that topic, I guess a 224 Valkyrie would suffer from the same fate if you're running them in an AR-15. If you're running them in a bolt gun, well, now what you have a little more latitude. You can seat your rounds longer. You can chamber the chambers long enough that the bearing surface is sitting as far forward as you can to help that free bore, the parallel part ahead of the neck, so that the projectile is properly aligned to that rifling as it starts into that rifling, and that's going to be where your accuracy is found. So that gets us into another thing, and we get into the clearances in the free bore, and you want to make sure that for high performance you want that to be as tight as possible, but not so tight that you create constrictions in the chambering of the round. You don't want it to be so tight that the round can't go in and it pushes back into the case, because that would be catastrophic. You'd end up with an overpressure situation. You don't want that. On the other hand, if it's extremely sloppy, well, now you got no bullet alignment, so it's not aligning into the rifling, and now you're going to have inconsistencies in both velocity and in accuracy, because they're going to be starting into the rifling at cockeyed angles, and the longer the round is, the more you're going to pay for that. So anybody who's involved in long-range shooting will always make sure that free bore is as tight as they can possibly get away with without becoming dangerous. So I know it's a lot to think about, and I'll illustrate more of that as time goes on, but again, we'll get into this in more detail. If I was to ask a group of shooters what performs better at long range, a 30-06 or a 308, it's pretty safe to say that most guys would take the bait and lay money on the 30-06. Why? Because it's faster and more powerful, right? While that may be true, we're here to discuss the ballistic coefficient of the projectiles being used today. And to be honest, the question as I framed it is simply unfair, but it is typical of threads you would often see on the forums. To answer the question will depend upon the weight and the BC of the projectiles being used in each example. Amongst these choices, projectile selection can easily make the difference, and by a long shot. To make this point, let's have a quick look at the numbers. If the same projectile is being used in both cartridges, then certainly the 30-06 would win, because we have now finished quantifying the comparison. So in this sense, the original assumption would be correct. But what if we use different projectiles in each cartridge? In the next example, we'll compare a low BC Sierra 30 caliber 150 grain FN in the 30-06 to the use of a higher BC Berger 185 grain Juggernaut in the 308. For comparative velocities, we'll simply reference the nozzler load data and ballpark the 30-06 muzzle velocity with a 150 grain projectile at around 2,800 feet per second. And we will ballpark the muzzle velocity of the 308 with a 185 grain projectile at around 2,450. In this example, the 30-06 will have a muzzle velocity that is 350 feet per second faster than the 308. Comparing the ballistic coefficient of these two projectiles, the 185 grain Juggernaut has a G1 BC of 0.552 according to the box. And the Sierra 150 grain FN is advertised to have a G1 BC of only about 0.224. Note that I'm being generous here in that the BC is actually a little lower than that for the Sierra 150 grain FN at higher velocities. But this is good enough to illustrate the first point. Let's go over to JBM Ballistics and calculate some trajectory data. Right now we're looking at the 30-06 on the left and the 308 on the right. Let's look at terminal energy. At the muzzle, the 30-06 clearly has a lead, but by only 50 yards, the higher BC of the projectile we're using in the 308 actually takes over. And the gap keeps opening up all the way out to 900 yards, where the .552 round has about 3 times the energy of the .224 BC round. What about drop? The 30-06 does win this race and is actually flatter to about 300 yards. But beyond that, the higher BC round out of the 308 takes the lead, even though it had a slower muzzle velocity. What about velocity? The 30-06 has lead only to about 150 yards. After that, the 308 with the .552 BC round takes the lead and walks away with it all the way out. We can do this all day, but I think the first point has been made. It's simply not fair to compare cartridge power to downrange performance without considering the projectile being used. By now you can see that the higher BC round, even after starting out with a lower muzzle velocity, actually outperforms the lower BC round starting out at a higher muzzle velocity. But by how much? When we review the websites of Hornady, Nosler, Sierra, Lapua, and Berger, you start to take notice of the BC of each projectile. We know higher is better, but what's the payoff in practical terms? How much performance do you actually get from a certain change in BC? This is where things come together in this video, and it gets really interesting at a practical level. To make this easier to comprehend, we'll use nice round numbers. I'll compare a projectile with a .250 G1 BC to a projectile with a .500 G1 BC. Let's forget about projectile weight because it makes no difference in trajectory at all. It's all about aerodynamic efficiency. So let's compare the flight characteristics of the .250 BC against the .500 BC if they both start out at the exact same muzzle velocity. Let's have a look at this trajectory chart. If we notice the velocity of the .25 BC round at 250 yards, we can see the .5 BC round has the same velocity at 500 yards. The .5 BC round goes twice the distance of the .25 BC round before it slows down to the same velocity. We can see here that the velocity of the .25 BC round is the same at 250 yards as the .5 BC is at 500. Since the BC is double, the round goes twice as far before it slows down to the same speed. The velocity degrades at the same rate as the difference in BC. Let's look out a bit farther. We can also see the 500-yard velocity of the .25 BC round is the same as the 1,000-yard velocity of the .5 BC round. Again, the velocity difference is linear to the difference in BC. So now let's have a look at wind drift the same way and see how that correlates. When we look at the wind drift for the .25 BC round at 250 yards, we can see that it has the same angular wind drift in MOA as the .5 BC round does at 500. And the wind drift for the .25 BC round at 500 yards has the same angular wind drift in MOA as the .5 BC round does at 1000. So the angular wind drift is directly proportional to the difference in BC. So in this sense, you can think about the difference in G1 BC just like yards. Comparing a .500 BC projectile to a .550 BC projectile, you'll find a 50-yard advantage at 500 yards and a 100-yard advantage at 1,000 yards. Now keep in mind that we did not even mention projectile weight, and there's a reason for that. The projectile weight does not matter. All that matters for a trajectory comparison is the expected muzzle velocity and BC. Projectile weight is factored in the establishment of the BC value, but it alone does not influence the flight characteristic. When you consider projectile weight, that factors into something called sectional density, and that's basically a value that says how much weight over the area of the diameter of the projectile. So something that is longer and weighs more has a higher sectional density than something that is the same diameter but shorter and weighs less. So if you take anything away from this video, the next time you're selecting projectiles for long-range use, consider the relationships illustrated here, and it'll help you determine where the advantage actually lies. and by all means crunch the numbers using your favorite ballistics calculator. Idealized projectile selection is quite simply one of the most important aspects of long-range shooting. Setting up your rifle so it's accurate with a projectile of your choice is another subject, and I hope you like and subscribe so you won't miss it when I discuss that in another video. I hope you found this helpful. This is Practical Tactical. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and thank you very much for watching.